All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. I'm happy to be joined today by Thomas Cargill. He is a research fellow at the Independent Institute and professor emeritus of economics in the College of Business at the University of Nevada, Reno. Thomas, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Glad to be here.
So we're talking to you about something that doesn't seem to directly relate to your bio, but is an interesting and timely commentary on both what's being taught in our high schools and what's being taught across the country as it regards to the issue of eugenics. I think that there was a good bit of attention paid in the past month or so to the decision by by Planned Parenthood, particularly Planned Parenthood of Greater New York, and their board chair, Karen Seltzer, who announced that they would be taking Margaret Sanger's name off of their facade, and she talked openly about it as a necessary and overdue step to reckon with our legacy and to acknowledge, quote, Planned Parenthood's contributions to historic reproductive harm within communities of color. They also requested that New York officials remove Margaret Sanger Square from the city's streetscape. This is a pretty significant break for an organization that has, long held up their association with Margaret Sanger, despite her affiliation with the eugenics movement historically. You have a report that was released last month in July on the way that high schoolers in particular are being taught about America's era of eugenics. Tell me a little bit about what you learned during the course of researching this report.
Well, the catalyst for that study was I had been teaching for a number of years history of economic thought, and I spent a lot of time talking about Malthus and eugenics and the progressive movement and Nazi Germany and the connection. And the students, by and large, were astounded with the information. They'd never even heard of this. They never even heard that 60 to 70,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized in the United States. And that's what sort of motivated me to write this paper. And given the reaction I had from students, I didn't expect to find a lot of stuff in the history textbooks. But I selected 9 well-known, very, very extensive textbooks. And I set up a criteria for whether they had given sufficient attention by looking at references to eugenics, to Margaret Sanger, to Buck versus Bell, which is a very famous Supreme Court decision that institutionalized forced sterilization. And some other criteria. And I was sadly disappointed, not terribly surprised, but students are not taught this part of this dark history of the United States and the role that people like Margaret Sanger played, and more importantly, the role that the progressive movement played in this movement. And finally, the connection between the United States and Nazi Germany.
Let's begin maybe with the court case that you talked about, Buck versus Bell. I've listened to a podcast or two and read about it a little bit. What did you find in terms of anything in our history textbooks, our major history textbooks for students, about this case? And tell our listeners a little bit about what it was about.
Well, Buck versus Bell was the state wanted to forcibly require Buck to undergo sterilization. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court in an 8-1 decision authored by Holmes, Chief Justice Holmes. He referred to the plaintiff as, we have to stop these generations of imbeciles. And that has got to be one of the stains on the Supreme Court. The only one that even matches it is the Dred Scott case, which institutionalized slavery. Mm-hmm. And ironically, not one textbook cited Buck versus Bell, not one. I mean, here we are in an age where everybody's concerned about discrimination against people of skin color, sexual orientation, religious, ethnic background, et cetera, and disabilities. In fact, we even have a law that sets aside certain preferences for disabled individuals. You would think that given his sensitivity to discrimination, that Buck versus Bell would receive at least as much attention as the Dred Scott case did. Now, by the way, I think all of the textbooks, maybe one didn't explicitly discuss Dred Scott. They can find time to devote that as the cause of the Civil War, but forget about Buck versus Bell. And then I also did a web search on teaching materials, and by and large, it just sort of disappears. But it does show up in Roe versus Wade. It actually is cited by the Supreme Court to the right of privacy is not absolute. And so here we have two events of the United States Supreme Court affirming the right to forcibly sterilize an individual because, as far as the Supreme Court's concerned, she's an imbecile. And we don't want to pass on those traits to future generations. And then 1973, where the Supreme Court literally made up a right out of thin air, they cite this terrible piece of this terrible decision as support. It leaves one almost breathless.
You know, it's interesting because to me, this is one of those aspects of American history that I would think would receive more attention given the context of the times and the context that you're talking about. That people look to the danger of discrimination based on any number of factors. Why do you believe that America's public schools have shied away from telling the history about this?
I think there are two reasons. The first is that progressives have been very, very successful in dominating American education, K through graduate school. Should not be a shock to anybody. The second reason is that eugenics and scientific racism are uniquely tied to the progressive movement at the turn of the century that continued into the late 1930s. And the progressives moved away from it. And I think one of the reasons why they changed the name of the birth control association to Planned Parenthood is to further disassociate themselves from eugenics, where by the late 1930s, Nazi Germany had pretty well laid out what the logical, end point of eugenics was. If you really believe in this stuff, then you have to get rid of the unfit. And so I think because of the role that progressives played in it, especially people like Margaret Sanger, Woodrow Wilson, there was a general reluctance to address that part of their history. It's sort of like the crazy uncle that lives upstairs, and nobody wanted to mention that, but everybody knew he's up there.
For most of the history that I read and that I grew up learning, Woodrow Wilson's true level of dedication to racist thought was not something that was put front and center. In fact, it was something that was kind of, you had to read through the lines in order to find it. But certainly, I think people are a little more familiar now with, the different steps that he took. Both in his treatment of Black political employees, eradicating them from his government, screening Birth of a Nation at the White House, that kind of thing. Tell me a little bit, though, about the connection between American progressivism at the turn of the century and the eugenics movement. What was really motivating it? Was it just an interest in science and the idea of the perfectibility of man? What was going on there?
I think there were three elements to this. The first was, why did America become the center for eugenics? Because it actually originated in England. And in the late 19th century, America became the center for eugenic research. And the rest of the world turned its attention to America, including Germany, before the rise of Hitler. And the reason for that is the Civil War and the 13th Amendment of the Constitution had given Blacks new economic power, new political power. And there was a great deal of concern that this would dilute the quality of American society. And I think the fact that such a large part of our population, which had been in slavery, all of a sudden were free. And there was concern about competition for resources, but really this, at the time the eugenics movement was rising, it almost placed on a high moral ground racism. You could be a racist and still a moralist, because what you were doing was ridding society of the unfit, so society would be more efficient. And also at the end of the 19th century, you had large immigration coming from the Mediterranean area and Eastern Europe. And these individuals were not very well educated. And it was, of course, very easy to make jokes about Poles and Italians. And it was mainly a lack of education, lack of verbal skills. And as Italian myself, I was subject to those kind of jokes when I was in school. And I think those two events, the immigration and the end of the Civil War and the freeing of the Blacks, raised real alarm here in the United States. And here comes eugenics. This, in a sense, sanctifies racism. The second development was the rise of the progressive movement at the turn of the century, that grew pretty powerful throughout the 1930s. And a lot of the policies of the progressives were enshrined into law in the Roosevelt administration. And one of the things that the progressives always believed in is that the market was not very good at creating efficiency. And it really required government to figure out how to achieve social justice, how to have a more efficient system. And so eugenics and progressivism were in a sense made for each other, because you had the progressives that said, look, we have all these instruments that we can use to improve society, and now we have this science that tells us how to do it. And of course, we do have a problem because of the dilution of the quality of the American society. You know, Madison Grant wrote the book, The Passing of the Great Race.
Can I ask you?
1916.
Yeah. And tell us, you mentioned a couple of books in your report: Passing the Great Race by Madison Grant, The Rising Tide of Color Against the White World Supremacy by Lothrop Stoddard. Grant helped found the American Eugenics Society in 1929. Tell us a little bit about these books and what they contained.
Well, what they did is they sensationalized the eugenics movement. Up until then, the eugenics movement was largely scientific at America's most prestigious universities. There was government grants for this stuff. There were German eugenicists coming to the United States, as well as from other parts of the world. And so these books were sort of like Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb.
Yeah.
You know, there've been a lot of discussion about population going back to Malthus, but Ehrlich sort of had the way, almost like a Madison Avenue advertising firm, of putting it into a very easy to understand framework that was sort of scientific, but more sensationalism. Mm-hmm. And that's what Madison Grant did. And by the way, the book was read by Adolf Hitler and well known in Germany. And Adolf Hitler, even in Mein Kampf, says, you know, America is ahead of us in terms of immigration policy and trying to clean up or improve the purity of its society. Mm-hmm. So, you know,
I just wanted to ask, as kind of a popularizer of this, Did Grant or Stoddard become kind of major figures, like public figures, through the course of this?
Oh, sure they did.
Mm-hmm.
They were involved with Margaret Sanger. In fact, Stoddard's book was reviewed in her journal, the Birth Control Review. And I'm not so sure what especially Madison Grant thought of Margaret Sanger. I've read different interpretations of that, but this was a fairly tight association of people who interacted and sort of supported each other. But Madison Grant was the popularizer.
Mm-hmm.
Margaret Sanger, in her journal, the Birth Control League, played a big role in furthering the concept of eugenics and the need to purify our society. And the journal, even though it says Birth Control Review, it had a much broader focus. So
let me ask, what was their attitude at this point toward what policies ought to be used to achieve their aims? Because this is well before the prevalence of abortion or anything like that, even in a in infrequent sense. What was it they were trying to do?
Well, the policy instruments that they were advocated, and were the ones that were actually put into law, were immigration policy that was outright racist. There's just no other way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
And this was one way to breed in the fit and breed out the unfit. Make sure that you didn't contaminate society. Second was sterilization. Voluntary, but forced if you have to do it. And over a period from the turn of the century all the way up into the 70s, about 60 to 70,000 women were sterilized, mainly women. And the number is probably a lot higher, because the difference between voluntary and involuntary is a difference without a distinction.
Mm-hmm. What was the process by which they would go to prove the need for this forced sterilization? Was it testing of cognitive ability? Was it just testimony from other people? What was the process like?
It would be testimony from other people, but you'd have to bring in medical expertise at some point. And the medical profession fully embraced eugenics, and the power of the state through law and coercion was used. And as I said, the difference between voluntary and involuntary sterilization is a difference without a distinction, because a lot of pressure was brought on individuals. And usually the targets were people who showed mental defects, physical defects, or some other characteristic that was deemed antisocial. And Margaret Sanger, in a publication in 1933, spelled it out in about the clearest terms that you could see about the kinds of individuals. She was an equal opportunity racist by any definition. She included the unemployables. Now, when you stop and think, who's an unemployable? Well, it's going to be a black, it's going to be a white, a white person in the South, people that are at the low economic level. She simply was willing to write them off. She also had a program called the Negro Program, in which they specifically targeted the Negro community to reduce the birth rate.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, most of the Planned Parenthood abortion centers are in the inner cities, in Black neighborhoods. Blacks utilize those services as a percent of their population base more than any other ethnic group.
Mm-hmm. There's the famous statistic, at least accurate a few years ago, that more Black children are aborted in New York than are born, which is a couple of years old, and we don't necessarily have the most up-to-date data, but has been true for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
You write in your report, I just want to read a little bit from it. Eugenics and progressivism were made for each other. Eugenics provided the science to categorize individuals as fit or unfit, and thereby was meant to provide a path to a healthier or more productive society. Progressives rejected the invisible hand of the market as the path to a healthy and productive society, and instead embraced the visible hand of an interventionist administrative state that based policy on science and experts as the more sure path. One of the elements of this that I think is so interesting is the story of the past, half century or so in American public life, maybe a little bit more, has been the degradation of trust since the 1960s in public experts of all varieties. We're talking health, science, different, people who basically have come forward and made claims. And it's a bipartisan level of distrust as well, and the failures of different administrations, and that is something that stretches and is a running theme of our political discourse. It seems to me that this is one area in particular that ought to be a part of that conversation of the failure of experts, of the failure of science to engage in anything more than a surface level consideration of morality. Their moral aim here seems to me to be completely at odds with our American understanding of individual liberty and rights.
That's right. The deep state does exist, and it's on both sides of the aisles too. And when we were asking about the forces that brought all this together, the third one, of course, is the progressives' reliance on experts. That was a key element. Not only did they think that the visible hand of government could make society better, but that visible hand was guided by experts. And all of the eugenics experts, and it's interesting, the movement then uses the same tactics that are used today. If you question that science, you were called a denier. You were called anti-science. Just like climate change today. If anybody raises an issue, oh, well, you're a denier. So anyway, this combination of concern with Blacks coming into society and immigrants, the rise of the progressive movement and the belief in the power of the state and the reliance on experts. It was a perfect storm. Scientific racism was created in the United States, not Germany. And that is another myth. It was created here. Mm-hmm. People sort of think, oh, Adolf Hitler sitting around in that jail after he tried to take over the government, and he worked out all of this scientific racism and how he was going to set up the concentration camps, and that's just not true. Mm-hmm. It was the United States. He got it from someone. Yeah. And I'm not the only one that makes this point. And there was a book that's cited in my paper by James Whitman that was just published, I think, Yale University Press. Mm-hmm. Very, very thorough, very sobering documentation of how Germany relied on the United States. It is a really inconvenient history that should be taught. We should, come to, if it's such a big deal for us to come to terms with slavery, why not this part of our history? Well, the answer is because the progressives were up to their eyeballs in this stuff. Mm-hmm. That's why they don't want to come to terms with it.
You have these quotes from a plan for peace that Sanger proposed in 1932. These are the various things that you quote: keep the doors of immigration closed to the entrance of certain aliens whose condition is known to be detrimental to the stamina of the race. Apply a stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of population whose progeny is already tainted or whose inheritance is such that objectionable traits may be transmitted to offspring. Give certain dysgenic groups in our population their choice of segregation or sterilization. Take an inventory of illiterates, paupers, unemployables, criminals, prostitutes, dope fiends, classify them in special departments under government medical protection, and segregate them on farms and open spaces as long as necessary for the strengthening and development of moral conduct. That's
Benign
1932. That's Margaret Sanger. That's amazing.
Yeah, well, those were benign concentration camps. But what's even more amazing is 1 year later in that same journal, uh, Ernst Rudin was invited to publish a paper on sterilization. Ernst Rudin, this was the year that Hitler became dictator of Germany, had just been appointed to a high position in the Nazi government for the euthanasia of a sterilization of mental defectives. And then a few years later, he took over the euthanasia of young children. And here is a Nazi publishing in this American journal about how a government should go about forcing sterilization. First of all, it's voluntary, but what you do is you make it free. So people think that, you know, it's easy, and you have to convince the medical community first and to pressure people that should be sterilized into a voluntary sterilization program. And of course, it's free. And then at the end of his article, he says, but the bottom line is you have to use compulsion. Mm-hmm. So not only do you have Margaret Sanger's Plan for Peace in 1932 issue of the Birth Control Review, a year later, followed by a high official in the Nazi government.
It seems astounding to me, but it is right there staring you in the face. I know that there's some people who've been, very uncomfortable with the way that these conversations, are underneath, all of these different things that we know. One of the interesting aspects of that Planned Parenthood story that I mentioned early on was the muted reaction to it from all manner of corners that had spent decades defending Sanger and defending her legacy, saying that, I remember fact checks, for instance, that would misquote her or would accuse people of misquoting her. I in fact, had an experience myself several years ago when I quoted her and had it back and forth with, I think it was PolitiFact, but it might have been another one about it, where they said, we can't find this quote anywhere. And I sent them to the pages of the New York Times where she had publicly written this quote. The types of expressions that she had, really didn't leave a lot to the imagination. It was clear what she was trying to do. Why do you think it is that when we talk about American history, people are, able to engage so publicly in conversations about things that happened in the 1860s and before, and their feelings about those? But these things that happened much more recently, while people who are still walking around, were alive. Planned Parenthood was only renamed, in the 1940s. That's something that it seems to me amazing that people are unwilling to talk about, and even more amazing that it's been basically banished from our schools.
Well, I think we have a real disservice to American society by not dealing with this. And the reason it's not dealt with is because the progressives dominate the education system. They dominate the textbooks, and they paint a picture of American society that is consistent with their ideology. This is nothing short of just the indoctrination of America's youth. And in some sort of...
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, you might say, well, how can a historian do that? I mean, should they present all history? One tenet of Marxian philosophy is that history is invariant in terms of where it's going. Nothing you do is going to change it. It is always going to end up in some kind of full communism, some kind of utopia, some kind of society where the world spirit comes together. And when you have that perspective, it's almost like what you do today is dictated by the end point of where you want to go. because why fight it? You have to contribute to that. And in fact, it was interesting. There's a fellow by the name of Leonardo who has published several books and studies about the progressive movements, and that they were the illiberal reformers. They did things, and he mentions eugenics. I focused only on eugenics. He does some other stuff. But there was a review piece of one of his books published in the Journal of Economic Literature, American Economic Review, that literally took him to task, because they said, well, the progressives, there may have been a problem here or two, but they've done so much good for society in moving it towards a better system where you have a government that takes care of people, a government that is engaged in social justice. We can't let those small little defects interfere. And so that's the progressive mind. And it goes into a deeper philosophy about romanticism. And, it helps understand Nazi Germany and Mussolini, and the idea of heroes, that there are just a few people around that see where we're going, that the rest of us just are too dumb or don't have degrees from Harvard or Yale to understand. And they have a completely different set of morality. They can't be judged on normal morality issues of truth, untruth. And so whatever they do to get us to this end point is okay. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of progressives, especially those that teach history, those that dominate our educational system, are well-meaning in the sense that they believe so much in this end point that the end justifies the means. And I think a lot of it is subtle. A lot of it is based on ignorance too, because some of this stuff involves areas that they're not really competent in. And the other is outright deception. I mean, I don't know how every one of the textbooks I looked at painted the progressives in a very, very positive light. A few would mention there were some eugenicists. There was some sterilization going on, but it was sort of like, well, I did my job, I mentioned it, and now let's talk about all the wonderful things they did. Mm-hmm. Like Margaret Sanger, not one of the books mentioned her eugenics views. All they talked about, she was a social reformer for women's reproductive rights.
I think that one of the aspects of this that we have to recognize is that it takes voices who don't typically talk about these issues to break through and make people connect with the truth. And just to give you an example of this, one of the NBA podcasts that I listened to was recently talking about Kanye West's comments in South Carolina. And one of the co-hosts just kind of weighed in to explain it. And he said, oh, well, what he's talking about is that there's this whole thing, where people have just realized that they disproportionately put abortion clinics in urban areas where they're overwhelmingly, used by, a much higher percentage of population by Black women who go in and have abortions. And that's what Kanye's talking about. And it provoked a whole conversation between them. But that's not a conversation that I think a lot of people are comfortable having in public about why that's the case, about why that was something that was intentional and not just happenstance or serving a market need in terms of the level of desire, but actually something that is itself, a vestige of an intentional past designed to destroy and diminish certain aspects of society that the progressives of almost a century ago, were emphatically in favor of doing.
That's correct. They still are.
Yeah.
I don't see much of a change. I'm very concerned about any kind of universal health system. There's simply not enough resources to give everybody free health. They're going to ration it in some way. And I think eugenics and eugenic-based policy, inspired policies, are going to come back in very subtle ways, such as assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide, pressuring people to end their lives as a way to reduce the demand for health services, especially at the end of life, people with Alzheimer's, dementia, so forth. You know, and you have states passing assisted suicide laws now. It's just a matter of time. This stuff's coming back.
Yeah. You know, I just briefly before we finish up, one of the things that I find to be really good about your report, and I think a lot of reports that deal with this issue, is to cut through the analysis and go to the original sources, to read what people were actually writing at the time. So much of our history is processed through, you know, revisionist books and collections that leave certain things out, major things, like I was saying before about Wilson's own, you know, racist beliefs and his policies. In terms of the primary sources, you've mentioned a couple in this conversation. What is one or two in particular that you would encourage people to go out, find, read? A lot of this stuff is free online; you can find it there, or to seek out in their libraries or in bookstores, just in order to understand and get the gravity of the aims that were going on here. You have to dig to find a lot of these things. But now, thanks to the internet, you can find them in ways that you weren't necessarily able to in the past.
I think that I could think of four things. First of all, the Birth Control League, or the Birth Control Review. All of the issues are online, and in my study, I gave a URL for that. You just peruse through that. Just the titles are upsetting. Because people, oh, well, it's just a journal about birth control. No, it's not. It's a whole agenda about how to produce a nation of thoroughbreds. The progressives, by the way, said that Margaret Sanger never used that term. That's incorrect. They found some articles where it was used. But anyway, second, Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race. That was a popular book. That had the same impact as Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb had in the 1960s. Back then, it made everybody aware that we have a problem, a crisis. You know, it's the ideology of catastrophe. And we've got to have somebody solve the problem. And here we have all these experts. They can tell us how to do it. And Stoddard's book, that's worth taking a look. Those were really popular books in 1916 and 1930, somewhere where Stoddard's book came out. And Madison Grant, by the way, wrote the introduction to Stoddard's book. And then fourth, I'd read Mein Kampf, Hitler's Mein Kampf. Just read the first couple of chapters. You know, if more people had read Mein Kampf, I'm not sure we would have avoided World War II, but I thought it may not have taken us by surprise. So those are, four original sources that people can turn attention to. And there now is some real serious scholarship going on about eugenics. And I think that's why Planned Parenthood, they saw the handwriting on the wall. The idea that they were unaware of this, it's an outright lie.
Yeah.
And just there's no other way to say it. I can't be polite.
No, I think that they were always aware that this was going to be an aspect of their legacy and of their founding that would be brought up at some point, and they would have to deal with it. And I think that they really were, to your point, I think they were just trying to get ahead of it and deal with it before it became a major media story.
I think they were shocked that Trump got as much vote as he did, and the Black Lives Matter. And in that kind of environment, they have to deal with their past. They're really forced to. And so they're willing to throw Sanger and Wilson under the bus because they're dead. Who cares?
Tom Cargill, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today to talk about your report. We'll obviously link it and send folks there. I really appreciate your insight on this subject.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.